compelling and vivid insights into what it is to be an artist. Your unquestionable urge to do, to make, and to follow curiosity and fascination with such elegant imagination, and your ever-present humour and warmth. It is all here in this remarkable exhibition. Thank you.
Newcastle, the city, I just fell in love with it as soon as I set foot there.
I remember feeling as if I was in a foreign country when I first went, because it was so different.
It was quite an extraordinary experience because I'd never been north of London, and here I was in Newcastle. I saw a man in Northumberland Street with soot all over his face, and on the trams I couldn't understand what people were saying to me. It took me quite a while to sort of tune in.
But the city was so alive and big, the wide streets and people. Of course, it was the time as well. It was the 60s and the music and the fashions. And Newcastle seemed close to London in that respect.
I was fortunate in Newcastle to be taught by both Victor Passmore and Richard Hamilton, and also ultimately to work with them in teaching. So I have a lot to be grateful to both of them for. It was very much by their example rather than one-to-one teaching that they were so influential.
I just was very lucky that I was in the department at a very lively time. Richard Hamilton running the first year course that he had set up with Victor Passmore.
We were on the front line, you know. We really felt like we were making something new happen, it was exhilarating. It was really fantastic.
Going up the steps into the department with the Hatton gallery on one side, the library, wonderful library, on the other, and then the studios, which are big, high, beautiful studios.
For me, the basic course was pretty fundamental. I just took to it as a way of thinking, not to turn one into any kind of artist, but to actually give one a language.
It made me capable of formalising some of my rather random thoughts and being able to convey them to a student who might wish to know about them or would take them on further.
Matt was studio demonstrator when I was a student. He was already a brilliant success. He was like the bright future.
I remember Matt very well because I was in awe of all of it, really. I mean, the basic course was, it was quite cerebral. Not all of it, a lot of it was, it was hands-on. It was all so new to me, everything. And I remember Matt leading projects.
He introduced us to the kind of history of what we were part of.
He took us seriously as students, even the ones like me who were so new to it all.
He made a kind of climate around us that encouraged creativity. He brings so much with him that I value very much about my art education.
I wasn't sure where I was, really. Everybody was a little bewildered, and particularly bewildered by the cause, because nobody had experienced anything like that.
I remember a lot of it being over my head, but now I kind of realise what it was all about.
It's still years later you can remember something he said or something that you're now ready to take on board. It was definitely an education for a future life as an artist, I suppose.
When I left, I looked at it all and felt that I hadn't made much progress, really, but it had been interesting and I'd I'd enjoyed it and I'd met some lovely people. But looking back on it from now, it was a life-changing experience.
It really was an incredible starting point and so different to what had gone before.
It happened so gently and so imperceptibly, the change that was happening in one's thinking, that one didn't recognise it for a while.
I just remember him coming in with tons of stuff. You know, he'd just bring in all sorts of stuff he'd found in skips or from his studio. He would just leave it in a huge pile in the middle of the studio for anyone to take.
It had real resonances with the way that my first year at St Martin's was conducted the following year in a slightly more authoritarian environment where we were locked in a room and given limited amounts of material. And to have discovered that Matt Rugg was running a similar course the year before, but with warmth and friendliness, was a revelation to me.
It's a way of looking at stuff, isn't it? So that instead of approaching a sculpture with an idea, with it being very kind of verbal or a narrative, it's very much looking at the stuff of the world.
It seemed particularly Matt's forte of looking at students' work, say, the end of the first year and so forth, and then discussing it. So it would be discussed in the terms of the work itself, and Matt was very good at this.
Phillida and Matt were, the two of them were the youngest members of staff, so they were closest to us probably in spirit as well. They would be very breezy about their approach. If you were working on a project that you were clearly immersed in, it wouldn't be a kind of savage condemnation of what you were doing. It would be much more a soft, let's look at what you're doing, let's analyse what you're doing and look at it in formal terms.
He did have this kind of attitude that was both intelligent and perceptive about whatever the student was doing, without being too aggressive about it. I found him a very interesting person.
I began as a painter, and it is part way between that process of leaving painting, moving into carved wood and block-like features, and into all of the other metal and whatever. Wishing not to stand still, really, sort of trying to find other means of expression.
I knew Matt's work before I'd even met him. So that at school, we didn't have a big art library at school, but Herbert Reed featured in the library and Matt features in Herbert Reed. So this very piece, in actual fact.
It's just so nice seeing stuff that's been handmade and hand-painted and obviously made over time with thinking. It's not made for a show, it's not made for any specific reason. A lot of love in it, I think.
In this exhibition here we have some really fine early works of Matt's, but I didn't know those. I didn't know anything about those. I didn't know anything really about Matt's early career. So I don't know how I'd relate them to the later works. The big difference between them on the wall and hanging in the air is that the wall's been made to disappear.
I was shocked when I saw the stuff at Rochecourt. The wooden pieces were so technically competent, you know, and painterly, you know, on that level. They were fairly remarkable.
It very much starts on the wall, doesn't it? And then it slowly starts to break out of the wall and become, I suppose, freestanding. And it's quite a slow process throughout the life, and that's nice. It's sort of animated on the wall, but then it becomes animated in space.
"52-Acre Lane" was a great arts complex.
In my last year at the Royal College, I was looking for a studio, and I found just behind where I lived in Brixton, there was an abandoned factory.
I think we used it in a way as a kind of a surrogate art school. I think people were rekindling the communal aspect of of how it had been working in an art school.
Acme took it over, and they invited me on to be a sort of works manager, administrator, and to help in selecting the artists to go into the studio. That's how I met Matt.
He'd just gone to the studio at Acre Lane, and I think it was the second day I was there. I came with the ready-made studio. I think they'd all slogged to sort of turn the studios into something lovely, and Matt had chosen the best place ever, which was this separate hut with the slanted roofs and everything else.
He and I were often enough the most regular users of the studios in Acre Lane. You know how it is with artist studios. Half the time no one's there because they all got to earn a living to be there. So the thing with big studio blocks is that a lot of the time there's only very few who are in regular attendance. Matt was there really a lot.
And then he turned up in this enormous great Volkswagen Jeep with completely white hair, I remember. And I thought he must have been so old, and I felt so young because I was 22 and he was 20 years older than me. But anyway, that's how we met.
I mean, we weren't in and out all the time, but because the studio that I had was opposite his in the yard, then obviously it was quite easy just to sort of put your head around the door. It looked like a fairly tidy scrapyard in there, I would say.
The studio was kind of full of galvanized, bits of galvanized steel. These works kind of evolved continuously. I never saw one finished. It was a bit like Penelope in the Ulysses story, kind of unpicking the tapestries. They did have a tapestry feel, and it was the most wonderful place to go to see these very, very intense drawn works.
Matt's work consists of wire and sheet metal and alloys and a lot of things lying on the floor in the process of construction. It seemed very directed. It seemed as though he knew what he wanted to do. And although it was very playful, and that's a word which I would use in connection with Matt's work, I think notions of play and playfulness actually go right through his work. And it's one of the things that makes it so endearing, I think.
So much more of it gets done on paper because it's faster, and there's something intrinsic about the nature of making the marks and things that, slow down once you start at all interpreting them in a material. They're made really with no sense of being blueprints for making, but in parallel things do get made so that one can immediately sense the likeness of their drawing like this, with the made nature of the object.
There were amazing drawings in the last show which I hadn't seen before. I mean, which perhaps someone else let out into the light. But there was that very brightly coloured drawing which I thought was just extraordinary, with this line on the left-hand side with those strange eye shapes into it and this broad changing sheets of colour. It was gorgeous, wasn't it?
I mean, obviously they do relate to the drawings. And if you look at the drawings, you can see, there's some way in which the drawings and these are connected. But the difference between the drawings and these is that you can't walk around the drawings.
I mean, I know that Philida said in her speech how close the drawings were to the work. I always thought that he faked it and did the drawings afterwards. But actually, I think the truth is that actually these elements are so drawn. They're so drawn out of physicality of making and also the physicality of doing drawing on a piece of paper. They become the same and they're interconnected and interdependent.
I tend not to draw in terms of things to make. I draw alongside, and obviously sometimes influenced by what happens when I start using materials, but they have, for the most part, some kind of sympathy with industrial form, which is as much a remembered case than an observed one.
It was incredibly popular, unbelievably popular. I remember doing a sculpture park in Weymouth, and a whole group of Chelsea kids came up and asked me why Matt Rugg was not exhibiting.
People used to say, well, it doesn't show very much, but, you know, he's working away in his studio, and that was a really good role model for us, I think.
He was quite quiet about his own work. I mean, although he'd had these important shows in the late 50s, early 60s, but he didn't tend to show very much after that. I did once ask him, why do you not show more? Because he was in the early books of surveys of British sculpture and so forth, and he was working and making work, and he was sort of diffident about it. He didn't give me a proper answer, really.
In the 20-odd years, 25 years that I knew Matt as a working artist, he never once exhibited a work, or he never once exhibited a work to my knowledge. He worked continuously.
We're all very ambitious to exhibit, and when someone doesn't exhibit and does it deliberately, then people always ask the question, why, you know?
But it was, I'm not bothered. But at the same time, when he did have a show, he was quite pleased, and he kind of, and he seemed to enjoy it very much.
I have a difficulty in being known as a sculptor, or I don't think many sculptors would embrace my work as sculpture exactly. And I think of it as being informed by painting much more than it is by sculpture.
There's as much painting as there is sculpture. But obviously my preoccupation back then when I first met Matt was the sculpture. So probably the colour, would I have thought it painting? I don't know. I would probably have called it colour. But I think now I would I think it deservedly needs to be called painting.
So he sort of somehow did away with colour and then started making, but they were always about these flat shapes. They were always about sort of painterly structures on the wall. And they didn't move too far from that.
When he stepped away from making the wooden works, what he stepped away from was a lump, however elegant that kind of lump is. There's nothing that's kind of lumpy about these rather lyrical, complex hanging works.
These strange, evolved lineal structures which hang and sort of breach that thing, especially with lines, so when they end up in a kind of heavenly plane up there, they breach the distance between, especially on an internal environment, the floor and whatever exists in the sky.
And yet the height is not specific. It don't have to be that height. It just happens that this roof beam is that height, and it sort of fits that. But it could be lower, and then it would be pushed out. There's a variability to them. The one thing they are like is they're like animal traps, and that you put your foot in it and bang, you kind of, that's it. You're kind of, it's got edges like a man trap.
And then later on, I think it was that of all the kind of humorous gestural works that he'd make with bending galvanized steel and working with that strange rubberized canvas that would create the eyes that kind of almost define his vocabulary for the last couple of decades.
Looking at Matt's work here in this fantastic space, what I love about it is that he's very comfortable with this domestic scale. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. I know some sculptors want to go big, 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 but I do like the way that he extracts so much out of really quite modest means.
I do remember an 80-year-old Matt with kind of very pale skin, stripped off his vest, sitting in the studio on a stool, and his hands were like, they were almost like superheroes' hands. They were enormous, and they were pulling down each piece of wire and folding it off.
One of the very lovely things about Matt's work, and about Matt, the man, is that although the art world is on steroids for success and money, Matt didn't worry about it. He kept to the first principles of art, that you do art because you love doing it, and it's something you have to do. And I think for all of his years, he didn't lose sight of it.
I think he's caring and loving, and also he's incredibly knowledgeable. He reads widely, but he also knows people. He attracts that kind of confidence with other artists, so he can communicate that with younger artists and younger students in a way that is fairly unique.
What I got from Matt was how to be an artist, that you just went to the studio every day and you made your work, and it didn't matter whether you had a show on or whether you were famous and getting lots of shows or not famous, or nobody was interested in you at all. But that's what you did. You were an artist. You went to work.
He always showed interest in what I did. He was very perceptive in his comments. He was always kindly in his behaviour towards me. Yeah, I loved him. He was marvellous.
Oh, he was just the most loving man you could possibly imagine. And I've missed him every day. Lovely fella.